Gates Foundation. I'm delighted to see all of you here. What an honor it is to see you in this continuing series on philanthropic freedom. Nobody typifies our movement better than our guest here today. I know that you've been following this conversation, and as are so many of our friends on social media. We're going to be taking questions from people here in the audience as well as over social media. So a quick bit of housekeeping before I get started. If you want to submit a question online, those of you who are watching us, please go to sli.do, and enter the code AEI event. And if I can understand your question, I'll be delighted to pose it to our guest. So I want to introduce our guest right now and get started here. I've been looking forward to this event for months now, and you're going to see why. Sue Desmond-Hellmann is a physician, a scientist, and now a philanthropist. One of the most extraordinary careers I've ever seen. She's currently, as all of you know, which is why you're here, the CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She leads an organization that has a mission that's remarkably similar to ours at AEI. They seek to create a world where every person can live a healthy, productive life, and every life has equal value. That's really important. I'm going to dig into what exactly that means, because it's one thing to say it, it's something else to create an organization that lives that every day. Sue was trained as an oncologist and spent 14 years of her career at the biotech firm Genentech, developing breakthrough medicines and also working in management, which is something that ordinarily scientists don't do, and we're going to talk about that. I can tell you as the president of AEI that it's a dicey business to get somebody with a PhD or an MD and make them into management. It's not typically successful, as a matter of fact. It was in her case. She was at the forefront of the medicine revolution, developing remarkable drugs during her time, including two of the first gene-targeted therapies for cancer. More on that in a second. She went from there to become the chancellor of the University of California at San Francisco, and after that became the CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the first outsider to be critically involved in that foundation, the largest foundation in the history of the universe as we know it today. So we have some interesting questions lined up, and I know you do too, but first start please by joining me in welcoming Dr. Sue Desmond-Hellmann. Sue, welcome to AEI.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm delighted to see you. You know, we met in person. I've followed your career, and we've been grateful that you've supported AEI, or the foundation has, for a long time. But we met at the TED conference in Vancouver this past February.
That's right.
And we had supper out there, and it was a pretty interesting experience. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but I think we both agreed that was a pretty nerve-wracking experience.
Terrifying to stand up there with this little circle, no notes, and know you had to, in a prescribed amount of time, which was difficult for me, give your pitch and then sit down.
It's just incredible. And imagine if you had to do that and Al Gore is in the second row and you're a conservative. So it was...
Okay, it was even harder for you.
But your TED Talk has been viewed more than 1 million times. It's incredibly highly regarded, and I recommend that all of you, when you're done today, go to the TED Talks and watch Sue's TED Talk. It's stunning, it's interesting, it's illuminating, and you're going to understand more about her and more about the foundation as well. I want to start with a little bit about your background. So interesting. And you know, if one of my kids said, I want to be a doctor, and I want to develop life-saving drugs, and then I want to run a university, and then I want to run the biggest foundation in the world, I'd say, you know, slow down there. Yet you've done this. You started as an oncologist, and then spent over a decade at Genentech, where you were developing gene-targeted drugs for cancer. Why did you become a doctor? What's the beginning of your interest in this field?
I became a doctor because I wanted to be like my dad. And my dad is a pharmacist. He was a retail pharmacist, and had a great relationship with Dr. Smirnoff, Dr. Noah Smirnoff, our family doctor, who I adored. And I thought that what Dr. Smirnoff and my dad did was like magic. Every single day they helped people all day long, and I thought that was a great thing. And I liked science and I liked math like my dad, And so the combination of getting to do work that was so inspiring and getting to study things that I liked, irresistible.
You have 6 siblings?
I have 6 brothers and sisters.
How many of them are in the field of medicine?
The first 4, pharmacist, nurse, nutritionist, and physician, and the last 3 were more like mom, good writers, English majors, so 2 English majors and an attorney.
Wow. So probably the only regret that your parents have is that they didn't get a priest or a nun, right?
They had big hopes for us, and I still smile about a great family story where I was in trouble, and one of the nuns said to me, "Why can't you be more like Judy?" My younger sister, one of my younger sisters, Judy, a year younger than me, smart, quiet, studious, lovely, to this day, lovely. And I said, "Why can't you be more like Sister Rosario? I like her better." I was promptly sent to the office, and I think that's when my mom and dad knew that I would not be a nun. Sorry.
What led you, I mean, I understand what led you into medicine, but why oncology specifically?
I actually, when I went to medical school, I'm really sporty, and I thought I would be an orthopedic surgeon. I really was inspired by sports medicine and thinking, that I would fix people up, get them back on the slopes or running or all of those things. And when I did my first rotation as a third-year medical student, I was with an oncologist at the VA hospital in Reno, where I went to medical school. And it was completely eye-opening for me. I loved the bedside manner, the connection with patients. I loved everything about the practice of oncology, and I was inspired by what it meant for patients. And then I loved the science of it. I loved that the oncologist I worked with was still learning about new therapies, was learning about the cell and how cells divide. And then when I did my rotation in orthopedic surgery, there were things like hammers and saws, and I'm not all that mechanically inclined. And it seemed, no offense to any orthopedists in the audience, but it seemed so carpentry-like to me. And I just, that really wasn't a good idea. You don't want me near a hammer.
I got it.
It was the opposite of the more cerebral part of medicine that I really like.
An orthopedist one time told me that the most important job he had was actually working in high school at the Jiffy Lube. So there you are. Now, a formative part of your life that I've read about, and I'm really interested in this, was you and I are both Westerners. Not in Westerners in the global sense. We're both from the Western United States. I'm from the real Washington, Seattle, Washington, and that's where you live now. You grew up in Reno, although you have a background in San Francisco as well. And you told me that when you were a kid, the East Coast was just really far away. And I remember thinking that.
Yeah.
There are people who've actually been east of Idaho. I remember thinking that was sort of an extraordinary thing. The first time, and you went to Ohio State, you spent some time at Ohio State, the farthest east you'd ever been, and then you picked up with your husband and went to Uganda to study HIV/AIDS, and it was this just kind of an amazing time of your life. It was a formative experience for you, right?
When I was at UCSF, I was just at the beginning of my faculty membership. And the University of California, San Francisco loaned my husband, who's an infectious disease doctor, and I to Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. So we sublet our flat, which we had finally scraped enough money together to buy. We sold our Honda Civics, and we moved.
How long were you in Uganda?
A little over 2 years.
Wow. What did you learn there?
Gosh, what didn't I learn? The most important thing I learned was that everything that I believed about poverty and about being less fortunate was wrong. That I underestimated how difficult it was if you really had nothing. That was the biggest eye-opener for me. That the level of poverty, the level of going without that people had just was stunning.
So let me turn that around a little bit. What is the biggest mistake that that Americans typically make about people who are in poverty?
I think that the biggest mistake is making the homologue of our own experience of people who are less fortunate in your own community or who you've met. And I think that maybe there's a piece of it about happiness too. That I met a lot of really happy people who didn't have a lot of things. There were communities that helped each other, that lifted each other up. And so there were opportunities and possibilities, even in the face of incredible poverty, that I didn't know were possible.
So wealth is about more than money. It's about dignity. It's about self-respect. It's about community. And there's a lot that we can do to relieve it, and it's not an ineluctable disease. It's not something that we simply can't do anything about. Were these the big takeaways from the Ugandan experience that were formative for you?
No, I think it was formative because I could see how small things made a big difference, how opportunity was something that people could take advantage of, and about how and about myself and my role as a leader and as somebody who wanted to make a difference in making something possible for other people that might not have been there had not I and colleagues made an effort.
So from there, you went back and you were at Genentech, and then you were the chancellor at UCSF, and then you found yourself at the Gates Foundation.
Yeah.
How did that happen? How did you wind up meeting Bill and Melinda, both of whom have shared the stage? That actually was in the old building. It wasn't as nice as this stage. They talk about the foundation itself and the formation of the foundation and the ideology and the idealism that went into that. How did you find your way to know them, and how did you wind up at the Gates Foundation as the first outsider?
Well, in some ways, it felt like I had been preparing for the foundation, but in fact, it was a surprise. My husband worked at the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation. He led their HIV efforts in 2005 to 2007. And so I knew the foundation because Nick, my husband, commuted to Seattle when I was still at Genentech, which was tough. It was actually really hard, and we missed each other, so he moved back to San Francisco. But I knew them just a little bit. I didn't know them well when Nick was there. But I had become a fan of the foundation, and when I was chancellor at UCSF, I made a bold attempt to recognize Melinda. So UCSF has a medal that's the equivalent of an honorary degree, and I got in touch with people around Melinda and said, do you think that Melinda would ever accept our UCSF medal? Because we'd love to celebrate everything that the Gates Foundation does and who Melinda is. And to my delight, she accepted. Right. And so I got to know Melinda and actually met her mom and dad, who came to the ceremony, and spent some time with Melinda as a result of her being awarded the UCSF medal. And I was just delighted to meet her. I found her inspiring. I found somewhat surprising how her focus on women and girls was so complementary to the technocratic view that I had from Bill's vision for the foundation, and how I heard Bill talk about the foundation. And I was really inspired by what they both brought to the foundation. But I was surprised when, having been chancellor for only around 4.5 years, they got in touch with me and asked if I would possibly be interested in being the CEO. It wasn't something I planned, but their value proposition, as you would say in the business world, was you can help us bring the foundation to the next level, and we need you. It was hard to say no to that.
Yeah. So it didn't take much convincing.
Actually, it did take some convincing. They spoke to me about it, and I found it impossible to leave UCSF. We were doing great work. I was really inspired by the work. I was all in on being the leader of this great university. And at one point, I tried to convince myself that I could do both jobs. So I had this crazy thing that I could just add on another job. And when I came to my senses, I decided that I would move to Seattle.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the first 70 hours and then the second 70 hours, that would be per week. When we met at TED, you gave a talk, the TED conference in Vancouver in February. You gave a talk on precision public health, and I want to challenge you. You said that we had 12 to 14 minutes to do it at the TED conference, which is pretty tough. Can you give it to me in 2 to 3? The precision public health, and again, you're going to get a flavor for this. You're not going to get all the details. Go watch the whole thing.
So precision medicine was something that I had a seat at the table in the early days. So for me, precision medicine was best exemplified by Herceptin, the breast cancer drug I worked on. Right drug, right patient, right time. Mm-hmm. But when President Obama announced the Precision Medicine Initiative, and I found myself watching the world really get religion on precision medicine, I worried about inequity, that precision medicine shouldn't become a way to further have the haves and the have-nots in medicine. And so I started focusing on precision public health as the right intervention for the right population in the right community. And the concept is bringing big data, geospatial mapping, mobile phone revolution, and sequencing, so it does include genetics, but not limited to genetics, to better understanding problems like malaria, polio eradication, tuberculosis, so that we could bring that kind of technology, innovation, pace, private sector, to the problems I cared about most in public and global health.
Wow. You started your talk with the reason you're so personally interested in that. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, I started my talk by telling a story about my own family, about how much fun it was, having been 18 years older than my youngest sister, to participate in her naming and having a family discussion about her middle name, Jennifer Bridget Desmond. And how delighted I was to participate in that, and how sad I was when I got to global health and recognized that some families delayed naming their first child for a month or more because they were worried that the baby would die. And so I started my talk by talking about the 2.6 million babies who die before they reach 1 month of age, neonatal deaths, and how I thought precision public health could end neonatal deaths, that no child should die before they reach 1 month of age, and specifically should never die of a preventable disease. And if only we knew better where those children are and what they're dying of, precision public health, everybody anywhere in the world would be delighted to name their babies the minute they're born, because they're dreaming of their future. And what I talked about was a future that could be measured in decades, not days.
Now, this is of a piece with a lot of what you think about and what you think about the Gates Foundation. I mentioned before that there's a synchronicity between the missions of AEI and the Gates Foundation. We talk here about the fundamental moral proposition of the radical equality of human dignity. And that in and of itself is a radical proposition, that every single person has the same inherent human dignity. That's an inalienable idea here at the American Enterprise Institute. I know you agree with that. You just said that. I mean, you were motivated to go into medicine in no small part because you thought it's not okay for those of us in one part of the world to have an expectation about flourishing and have the different set of expectations about flourishing for other people in the world. It's not right to have different expectations about people just because they're born in different places. The Gates Foundation asserts that all lives have equal value. Now, we take seriously our own mission and we try to live it every day. You do too. So now you're at the Gates Foundation and you have this, you're motivated by this. It's really been a foundational principle in your own career. What does that mean in day-to-day work at the Gates Foundation, that all lives have equal value?
Well, it means that everyone, no matter where in the world they are, should have the chance at a healthy and productive life. So for us, that means in the United States that we've decided that education is that lever. In the United States, we have inequities, some of which are based on opportunity. And so Bill and Melinda early on decided that focusing on education would be the great human potential investment we would make in the U.S. Outside of the U.S., We've focused very strongly on global health, especially infectious diseases, which often affect the poorest, and on development. So things like agriculture, smallholder farmers, things like nutrition, family planning, mobile money, all of which have in common the opportunities that people have for healthy and productive lives.
I know that you believe in also, as we do, in the equality of dignity, but what do you see as the big barriers to the equality of human life, particularly as you look, let's stay in the United States for a moment. We'll go to sub-Saharan Africa in a minute, but in the United States here, you said that the big barrier to it was an education system that was inequitable. So let's drill into that a little bit more. What is it about the American education system that we most need to change such that all people can lead lives of equal human dignity?
Well, a couple
or
of
potential, I should say.
Dignity, potential.
Right.
I think we have in common that everybody matters.
Yeah.
Everybody matters, and everyone should have a chance. So the foundation's focused on K through 12 and public education, and the focus has been on teaching. It's really clear that if you have a great teacher, great things happen for you. So making sure that teachers have what they need to prosper, that they get good feedback on how effective their teaching is, that they have access to developing themselves as teachers, whether that's video feedback, feedback from observers. So we focused a lot on teachers, and we focused a lot on curriculum. So we were supporters, and I know it's not popular, but we were supporters of standards, of the Common Core curriculum, which really has been a multi-state effort to look at making sure that if your kid graduates from a public school, that they know fractions when they finish fourth grade, that they know a certain thing that allows them to move state to state and allows them to be career or college ready. So our K through 12 work has all been around giving every kid, no matter what their zip code is, in public education a chance to have a great teacher and to learn and be ready for college or be ready for a career. In post-secondary, our college program, we focused on access and affordability of a college education.
What's your view on the new movement that we're getting involved in here at AEI in vocational and technical education as an alternative to college? I think we both agree that the sort of the paradigm of everybody must go to college is unproductive and perhaps insane. But people need alternatives such that their skills can meet their passions and can meet the needs of the American economy. So what's your view on how education reform can take the new movement of vocational and technical education and apprenticeships into account?
I'm extremely positive, and the Foundation's very positive about when we say career ready. Careers come in various flavors. They don't always come after a college education. So vocational training, great. Internships, great. One of the things that we've invested in is better support and technical innovation in things like advising. So it would be terrific if you knew careers that both you would be inspired by and you would prosper in. Some of the new advising technical support makes that possible. It gives you better insights into the kinds of things that you might not have known were possible for you, that you may have both a talent for and something that's a good job.
Is the Gates Foundation going to stay in the education revolution in the near term? Right?
We're all in on education.
You're all in, and you're going to be all in for as long as it takes.
We're all in for the long haul, and we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot of lessons. We've learned a lot about school districts, superintendents, principals, a lot of the aspects of leadership in U.S. public education that we increasingly have insights into. You and I were talking about place, the importance of place. Community and place in education matters a lot. And thinking locally about that place, that community, that school district, what those parents care about, what the teachers care about, and increasingly what the students care about is driving reform in public education these days. It's one of our big lessons in terms of feedback, and I think we can take advantage of that as a country when everybody wants kids to have a great education. That's a universal phenomenon.
Let's go outside the United States now, and let's address something that's actually a little bit controversial these days, although I don't think it probably should be. if you've been paying attention to anybody here, paying attention to politics over the past year, which if you weren't, you probably wouldn't be here at AEI, or you've been living in a cave someplace if you haven't been, and you notice that the populism of the current moment in American politics has people talk a lot about the evils of globalization. Now this is an odd concept for a lot of us here. Globalization is something that we recognize has pulled 2 billion people out of poverty since 1970. Yet to be a globalist is suddenly an epithet. Bill and I have talked about this, and I can tell you, in the audience, Sue knows this better than anybody, that Bill and Melinda utterly reject the notion that globalization is a bad thing. How do you talk about it internally, and how do you make the case that we need a more globalized world, not a less globalized world?
It's actually surprising that it's controversial, honestly. Right. But I respect that people worry about the downsides of globalization, or that they might be harmed, or their neighbor might be harmed by globalization. So the way that I talk about globalization is it's all about opportunity. We've been talking about potential and dignity and opportunity. The positives that I see about interacting with people who are from a different place in the world, about looking at the world coming up, ending poverty, as Bill has talked about, that at the foundation, and I personally see that as all about opportunity. Opportunity for all Americans, opportunity for my neighbors, opportunity for my community, but for all communities in America, that globalization sort of opens your eyes and lifts up your spirit. It's about history and culture and differences in really positive ways. But from a business proposition, which I think is a lot of the discussion going on now, it's all about opportunities. If you're an entrepreneur, it's new markets for you.
Right.
So I think those are the ways we think about it. I think if you think about it as squeezing wages, losing jobs, outsourcing, those kinds of things, I think, again, if you care about human potential, you think about what is the training, what are the opportunities, what do people need to be competitive in a globalized world?
Oh, so I think that the common theme that we're seeing running through this is that the Gates Foundation is very positive about the concept of globalization as it helps people in poor countries, as it creates opportunities for those of us, it raises living standards. And at the same time, those who are displaced by it, that they meet up with your education agenda here in the United States. And so are these the strings that actually tie the certain parts of the Gates Foundation agenda together?
I don't know that we were as purposeful as what you just said, but I do think they do tie together. That as the world changes, which it will, and it does, we want everybody to be ready for those changes and have opportunities for lifelong learning. And actually, I think one of the things that's been interesting in our education agenda, and it's a big part of reform in medical school curriculum, which is how do you train to be a lifelong learner? Most of what I use now in medicine and science wasn't discovered when I went to medical school. So the most important thing I learned in medical school was how to learn, how to keep myself informed, how to be a learner and a reader, how to read scientific literature. And the best education focus is to learn how to be a learner.
Oh, so workforce development should be about a learning population, one that can update its skills, its knowledge, et cetera, no matter where we are in the education spectrum or in the spectrum of skills across the economy. Should that be our goal?
Without any doubt.
Interesting. Yeah. Now, again, Sue is saying something that I want to underline here. You know, we tend to think of education reform as something that happens with the quality of a school district or a superintendent or a teacher between the ages of 5 and 18. Now we're talking about filling in the gaps between birth and retirement. We need to think about education in a very, very big way that is focused on our ability to match our passions with needs, with skills that are needed in the workforce for the modern economy, such that we can all benefit from the blessings of globalization. That's a big agenda.
It is a big agenda, but I will tell you, one of the things that I think has been terrific about my own experience of coming to the foundation is how much the learnings globally inform how we think about things here. So I'll give you one example. 2 years ago, we made a big increase in our investment in nutrition. And you might think if you care about healthy, productive lives, nutrition would be an obvious investment for the foundation to make. And that may be something like food fortification, it may be exclusive breastfeeding, a lot of things in global nutrition that I haven't thought about for a long time. But there's a concept in the global nutrition space that's called the first 1,000 days. So the first 1,000 days is conception to age 2. It turns out that the first 1,000 days is like magic. If you want to have a healthy, productive life, you want your mom to be well-nourished, vaccinated, and to have her first child when she's ready to have her first child. And so old enough to be healthy and have a child. You want her to have a healthy pregnancy. You want her to have an HIV test to make sure that you can be born without HIV. You want her to have a safe delivery. You want her to be able to exclusively breastfeed for 6 months or longer. And you want that baby to get all the nutrition and all the vaccines that they need so that from conception to age 2 is like magic. If you want a healthy, productive life, that sets the stage for everything that happens to you after that. And frankly, if that doesn't happen, you have things like stunting, wasting, and decreased cognitive development. Just as it's true internationally, I think that we should think a little bit more about that domestically. What are those first 1,000 days like for an American child? From conception to age 2 is like magic. And as an adult oncologist, I think, wow, where I cared about tobacco control or things that I thought would be good at preventing cancer, the magic of that first 1,000 days, if you care about public health, global health, or human potential, is something that after I learned about that, I thought, that's something to spend more time on.
Interesting. Let's talk more about how we can actually improve people's lives outside the United States. When Bill Gates was on the stage here at AEI, he said something very visionary and startling, which was that he believed that by the year 2035, there would be no more poor countries left in the world. What's that all about?
That's Bill, which I like. He's a big thinker, and he's actually quite serious about that. I had a discussion with him about some of the innovations that we're working on in vaccines and how we think about it. And at one point, I was pushing him, and I said, "Boy, by 2030, I'm worried that this will be really hard." And he said, "Well, by then we'll be nearly done with poverty, so don't worry about it." And I thought, that is an optimist. Yeah. I love that. But he's serious about it, and he's serious based on data. There are fewer poor people now, and the pace of decreasing poverty is such that when Bill and Melinda wrote their annual letter, which they write every year, when they wrote it at the beginning of 2015, they made a big bet. And the big bet was that between 2015 and 2030, more people would come out of poverty in those 15 years than at any other time in human history. And that wasn't dreamy. That was based on the trajectory we've seen in the world, largely driven by China up to now. But that when you look at what China has done and other Asian countries and many countries around the world, it is absolutely possible to think that the world will not have the kind of dire poverty that we've seen when I was a young kid by 2035. It's not crazy.
Extraordinary. And Bill will be delighted to know that the president of the CEO of his foundation said that his biggest idea is not crazy.
You can repeat that.
No, that's right. That's right. And it's on tape too. So it's really inspirational. And by the way, the idea of making big bets is something that we're required to do, as far as I'm concerned, in public policy and cultural change, which is the business that we're in here at AEI as well. There's a tendency to look around the world and sort of have the courage to dream incremental dreams, which is it's thinking a little too small. So I couldn't be more appreciative or laudatory of the fact that you're actually thinking this way. And the data do, in fact, reside on the side of that argument. Yet we still have a lot to do to make sure that it's so. And I know that you're all in on that. We're going to go to the audience in a minute, but I have one more question before we do that. So get your audience ideas ready, and then we're also going to go to the iPad to see who's logging in. We've talked about success and vision and a lot of happy things here. But you and I, the first time we met, it was really interesting to me because one of the things that we discussed was how we've tried to develop as leaders of organizations in the idea space. And one of the things that we quickly decided was that learning and improvement actually don't come from successes and nice things. Ordinarily, they come from failures. Any great foundation is going to make some big bets. Any great foundation is going to have some failures. What's your biggest disappointment, and what did you learn from it?
Since I've been at the foundation, I would say the biggest disappointment we just saw in August this year, and that was recognizing some cases of polio again in Nigeria. The world had happily gone 2 years polio-free in the entire continent of Africa, and I mean endemic polio, the kind that we're trying to wipe out. And when these 2 cases were reported in Nigeria, it was a big setback. It was a setback that said what we had thought was the end game in Afghanistan and Pakistan now needed to include Nigeria as well. And it was a setback because the surveillance had let us down, and because we recognized and were reminded that where Boko Haram is, where there's unrest in Nigeria, and where the vaccinators can't reach, remains a threat to eradicating polio and ending that terrible disease for the world. So that was a setback. And yet the global community that is working hard together to rid the world of polio redoubled our efforts, and we're continuing to push to end what would only be the second human disease ever eradicated after smallpox.
And the big lesson that the foundation, how does the foundation do business differently on the basis of that knowledge?
I think we push ourselves to ask more when we think we have good news. Is it really good news? Or is it ignorance in places where we just couldn't get the surveillance we needed?
Permanent victories are really, really hard to attain. And even when they look like permanent victories, it's probably wise to treat them as if maybe they're not. Thank you for that lesson. I think it's useful to all of us. We're going to go to the audience now. Before I turn to the audience, remember, if you're watching online, sli.do is where you need to go on the web, and your login is AEI event. We'll start here right in the front row, and then we're going to go to the back. Can you wait for a microphone, and if you could tell us your name and affiliation?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Laszlo Mizrahi, and I'm a full-time philanthropist just on a much smaller scale. I'm so amazed and impressed by the work that you and the foundation are doing, and I wanted to ask, because of your real commitment to equality and dignity of every individual, if you had seen the annual letter of Darren Walker on people with disabilities and the work that they're doing to change their foundation to ensure that people with disabilities work for their foundations or involved with their foundation, and that when they give money that they have access to their services, things like captions and screen readers, and how that impacts in particular your goal of high school obtainment, given that only 61% of Americans with disabilities complete high school.
Thank you for your question. I'm a big fan of Darren's and did read his letter and talked to him about the experience he had personally of getting feedback on how some of his employees didn't feel like the Ford Foundation was addressing the area of disability. In our education work, we haven't specifically focused on disability, but we have focused on the public education system, which requires that all have access to a public education in America. So access for people who are disabled is inherently part of our focus in the K through 12 space. It's also a focus at the foundation that we want everybody to be able to work at the foundation no matter what their background is. I think it's really interesting to see the learnings that Darren has brought to this and the leadership he's brought to that. And one of the things our K through 12 strategy is looking at is, as we look at access, as we look at human potential as being the key part of our education, how will we look at K through 12 going forward in the future now that there's been so many changes in the U.S. education system? So we're updating our strategy, and come 2017, more to come in that space. Thanks for your question.
Before we go back here, one of our interlocutors on the web noticed that you used the word technocratic, technocrat in a positive way to describe Bill Gates and Bill Gates' vision. We like to rehabilitate terms like nerd here at AEI, and technocrat, let's take it back. I agree with that entirely. Lisa Daughtry-Weiss from Sojourners asks if you could give one message to the incoming Trump administration about how to support global health. What's the one piece of advice you'd give them?
I only get one.
Well, it's you had the silver bullet, which is the first 1,000 days, which I think is going to be a big takeaway from this audience. So. If you could, what would be at the top of your list?
My number one thing that I would want President-elect Trump to remember is that a health crisis anywhere is a health crisis everywhere. One of the major lessons learned from Ebola was something that even a medical student had to dust off the book and go back and remember what Ebola was. Less than 3,000 cases on Earth between 1976 and 2014 could be a potential global public health crisis. So a global health threat anywhere is a global health threat everywhere.
Huh. Back here, we'd sit right here, this gentleman who had his hand up and on the aisle. We got a mic coming to you right now. We have 2 mics coming to you.
Hi, thank you, and thanks for your comments. My name is Carl Polzer, and I started a project called the Center on Capital and Social Equity. Similar mission, not much money. But one of the big bets that the Gates Foundation has made is on creating a vaccine, a breakthrough vaccine for RSV. There was a $90 million grant to Novavax, a company that functions around here. And in that grant, there was some wording about making that available at affordable cost to developing countries where it mostly causes issues. But there wasn't really a specification about how that would be determined. And I'm curious, I mean, I know this might be too much in the weeds, but I'm a shareholder of the company. How is that going to be determined? Is it going to be determined based on some kind of relative GDP? Is it going to be based on providing full access to everybody who needs it? Because we know from the breakthrough drug for Hep C, that isn't even available in the U.S. to all people, even all people on Medicaid. Or is it going to, how is a profit built in for the company to continue developing more cures? Is that okay?
So I really appreciate your question. It allows me to make a few points that I think are in answer to your question. One is we strongly believe that engaging the private sector is a net positive. It brings all the talent, passion, pace, sustainability that all the people who we're trying to serve need. Whenever we make a program-related investment, like we did for respiratory syncytial virus, the investment you're citing, there must be a charitable intent because we're a 501c3. So the charitable intent is that contract that requires global access. So the global access means that there is a means of making sure that people who are poor have access to the vaccine should they succeed. We don't require companies to become not-for-profit. That isn't the idea at all. But one of the key global mechanisms that allows for this is the Global Alliance for Vaccines, Gavi. They use a tiered pricing formula that allows poorer countries to get a low price, whereas richer countries pay full price. So many, many multinational companies and small companies have been able to interact positively with Gavi and enable now nearly 500 million kids since 2000 to have access to vaccines and the companies to make a healthy business.
Question has just come in from Larissa Friesen Hall about the sustainable development goals that we often hear about. How is the Gates Foundation working to support sustainable development goals around the world?
So the Sustainable Development Goals are the goals that the world has put in place between now and 2030. There's a number of goals. There's everything ranging from education to health to climate, thus the sustainable. We don't interact with all the Sustainable Development Goals, but we're very much a part of many of the Sustainable Development Goals, most importantly to further decrease under 5 mortality for kids that's preventable and to improve maternal outcomes.
Let's see, we're going to go to Adam Meyerson, President of the Philanthropy Roundtable.
You mentioned agriculture. One of the great achievements of philanthropy in the last century was Norman Borlaug's Green Revolution, really dramatically increasing productivity yields in Latin America and Asia. 15, 20 years from now, what would you like historians to say about the role of philanthropy in transforming agriculture in Africa and other parts of the world over the next 2 decades?
Well, it would start with smallholder farmers being able to increase their productivity so that smallholder farmers, especially women, can both feed their families and have increased means to withstand shocks or send their kids to school, and that smallholder farmers would have the tools they need to deal with climate change.
Adam reminds me of a question that we have coming in here from Maka Payares of Philanthropy Daily that talks about philanthropy per se. I think that everybody here would agree that one of the great successes of the United States in solving social problems is the tradition of philanthropy, which is rather extraordinary around the world. The Philanthropy Roundtable that Adam leads talks about this constantly. I know that Bill and Melinda have tried to migrate this concept to other places around the world such that there is a greater tradition of the private solution to public problems. What is the foundation doing, and what's the latest on the efforts to make people around the world more philanthropic?
Yeah, it's actually one of the probably under-recognized parts of our mission is that we want to inspire others to give. And you don't have to be Bill and Melinda Gates or Warren Buffett to be generous.
That's good.
I like to tell people that combating infectious diseases, I use a word with generosity that I tend to avoid, which is contagious. Generosity is contagious. If you want to be inspired, try a little more generosity, and your neighbor might be affected by that contagion in a really positive way. So it starts with the Giving Pledge that Bill and Melinda and Warren have made the Giving Pledge very visible, and that's a global effort for billionaires. If you're not a billionaire, we celebrate things like today. We're celebrating Giving Tuesday. Different ways of making organizations really visible and enjoying the fellowship of being generous together. And I think that that's one of the ways that within the foundation we're all inspired. We partner with the United Way and go out in the community in King County and Seattle, which you know very well, and participate in maybe in a homeless shelter or a place for abused women or a school or the Y. It is a part of the DNA of the foundation to be philanthropic. And when Bill and Melinda and the rest of us travel to places like India, China, Sub-Saharan Africa, we don't just talk about philanthropy, we also work on policy and advocacy so that tax law and the conditions in the community are such that people who have the means will be generous.
One of the things that Bill has talked about, not central to his philosophy, I don't think, but it's something he has a point that he's made that's quite profound, is that philanthropy is an outstanding thing for the giver, him or herself, and something that we found here at AEI as well. We're going to take one right here in the second row. Yeah, Mike's coming to you.
Good morning. I'm Christine Davies with the Asia Society. And I'm curious, a big topic today is the currency of reliable global data and information, especially because there's so much information out there that we have to sort through. And I'm curious what the Gates Foundation's approach to this is, the types of global knowledge networks that you've either developed or that you're involved in to really help inform the projects you're doing now, the projects you're doing in the future, to ensure diverse perspectives and to keep the noise out of the conversation as much as possible.
It would not be an overstatement to say we're obsessed by data. We're super obsessed by data. The foundation very much thinks about data, though, in terms of its credibility but also in terms of the data getting to decision makers. So one of the things about data and the foundation that I'm really positive about is, and one of the most recent investments we made is in a CHAMPS network, a global surveillance network to make sure we deeply understand the causes of death in young children. We're thinking about that data as two pieces that are very important. One is capacity building, so laboratory capacity building, so we have good access to data that's believable on the laboratory diagnosis of the conditions, but that data gets to caregivers, that gets to parents who will make their own family decisions for their next child, should they lose a child, that the physicians or the clinicians who are caring for that child, that the local Ministry of Health, and that the government of that country has access to those data. So data that's available for decision making, that's credible, and has the attributes that decision makers need to drive policy and their own country agenda is deeply important to us.
We have time for one more question. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them, but Sue actually has a date with our television studio downstairs as soon as we're done here. So we're going to take the last question right here in the front row.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Peter Matlin. I'm currently with Cornell University, and I retired several years ago from the Rockefeller Foundation. And during the last several years of my career there, I was able to work very closely with the Gates Foundation in designing and launching AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, and also AWARD, the African Women in Agricultural Research and Development Program, again, based in Africa. The passion, the vision, the risk-taking of the Gates Foundation was greatly appreciated by us in the Rockefeller Foundation, where we could take proven approaches and take them to scale. What we did find, however, is that while Gates quite appropriately urges grantees to diversify their funding, to not be dependent on a single funder, particularly Gates, we found that it's very often difficult when you are founded by the Gates Foundation to attract other donors. And we on the ground basically call it the Gates curse. When other donors are approached, they say, well, Gates has bottomless pockets. Why don't they provide the support? Or if Gates is beginning to phase down their support to encourage new donors coming in, they interpret that in the wrong way, that something isn't working, Gates is pulling out. What can the Gates Foundation do early on in the launching of such programs as AGRA and AWARD to establish a basis which would be more attractive to bring in new donors from the get-go and to get the other donors to put their fingerprints on these projects so that they can have true ownership and a commitment to continue?
This is an interesting question, and I want to broaden that just a tiny bit. How quick can any foundation do that's large? Because we're going to see more and more multi-billion-dollar foundations in the coming years. And for that matter, what can the U.S. government do as an early investor in lots of these ideas? Because if there's a Gates Foundation curse, there's a U.S. government curse that's that much more grave. So this is a systemic problem.
Yeah. No, I think one thing that's just at the start to point out is we're now 16 years old, so we're still pretty new at this, and we've learned a lot, particularly about the area that you're talking about, which is the Gates Foundation money. It can be that an organization wants to tell everybody that the Gates Foundation has invested in them because there's something positive about that. It's like a good housekeeping seal of approval, so to speak. And yet people can assume that you're completely funded. So I think one is to work with our grantees and our partners so that we have a shared understanding of the pros and cons of having Gates Foundation money, to diversify from the very start, and to work on being a healthy organization. I think is more important than anything else is that organization has the leadership and the management it needs. I'll give you an example. Our head of human resources now works with grantees and partners to ask them, how are they thinking about talent? How are they thinking about leadership development, succession planning, some of the things that the not-for-profit sector, as you know, isn't well known for. So I would say that the most important thing for us as an organization is putting on our list of priorities that our grantees and partners are healthy and sustainable. It starts with that.
We've come to the end of our time, unfortunately. I want to thank our audience. Wait a second. We want to thank our audience out here in internet world. Thank you for your interesting questions, and thank you for your attention to this. Thank you to all of you, and join me in thanking Sue Desmond-Hellmann for joining us today.